In the summer of 1942, thousands of Allied prisoners stepped off cattle cars into a green hell that stretched 258 miles through Thailand and Burma. The Japanese called it the Thai-Burma Railway. The men who built it called it something else, the Death Railway. For every mile of track laid, 38 men died. By the time the last spike was driven, over 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and 90,000 Asian laborers had perished from disease, starvation, and brutality. This is what they said when they first saw what their captors expected them to build and how they survived the impossible. February 15, 1942, Singapore fell. Not in a blaze of glory, but in silence, surrender, and disbelief. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked into the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah and handed over the largest British military force ever to capitulate. Over 80,000 Allied troops, British, Australian, Indian, Dutch, became prisoners of war in a single stroke of a pen. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had crumbled in just 70 days. They marched through the streets in columns, exhausted, stunned. The city burned behind them, smoke blackened the sky. Japanese soldiers lined the roads, rifles at the ready, watching the defeated shuffle past. Some prisoners of war still wore torn uniforms. Others were barefoot. All of them are hungry. All of them are afraid. Changi Prison became their new world, a barbed wire universe on the eastern edge of Singapore Island. Built to hold 600 inmates, it now swelled with tens of thousands. Men slept on concrete floors. Rations dwindled to rice and rumors. Disease spread like wildfire, dysentery, malaria, cholera. But Changi was only the beginning. By mid-1942, Japanese engineers arrived with maps and ambition. They unfurled blueprints across rickety tables and pointed to a thin red line stretching 258 miles through the heart of Southeast Asia, from Ban Pong in Thailand to Thambusayet in Burma. A railway, through mountains, through the jungle, through terrain that had swallowed every expedition that dared enter it. The Thai-Burma Railway. Japan needed it. Their supply lines to Burma were choked by Allied submarines prowling the Bay of Bengal. Every ship sunk meant fewer weapons, fewer reinforcements, fewer victories. The railway would bypass the sea entirely, a steel artery pumping men and materiel directly to the front. But there was no machinery, no bulldozers, no cranes, only prisoners and time. The Japanese engineers estimated it would take 5 years with modern equipment. They gave themselves 14 months, and they would use slave labor to do it. When the prisoners of war Ows first saw the maps, when they heard the plan, disbelief rippled through the camps. They want us to do what? Build a railway, through monsoon-soaked jungles infested with malaria and tigers, across rivers that swelled to torrents overnight, over mountains that had never been successfully crossed, with hand tools, bamboo, and bare hands. Among the prisoners were engineers who understood the scope. There were clerks who'd never lifted a pickaxe, infantrymen who'd trained for battle, not for digging through rock and mud. They were soldiers, not laborers, but rank meant nothing now. They were simply bodies, expendable fuel for Japan's war machine. The first work parties were assembled. Officers protested. The Japanese ignored them. And so they marched, out of Changi, onto cattle cars and barges, north into Thailand, deeper into Burma, into the jungle that would become their graveyard. They didn't know it yet, but they were staring at the blueprint of their own graves. June 1942, the work began. Not with ceremony, not with speeches, with the crack of rifle butts and the bark of orders in a language most prisoners didn't understand. They were dragged from camps at dawn, formed into work parties of hundreds, marched into the jungle with nothing but crude tools, axes dulled by overuse, shovels bent from stone, bamboo baskets to carry earth. No bulldozers, no explosives, just men and the jungle. The routine was simple, brutal, unending. 12-hour shifts became 14. 14 became 18. They hacked at trees thick as telegraph poles. Roots snarled like iron cables beneath the soil. They carved pathways through hills that had stood untouched for centuries. They moved earth, thousands of tons of it, one basket at a time. 2 men to a stretcher, up slopes, through mud, under the weight of monsoon rain that turned the ground into swamp. The Japanese engineers watched with clipboards in contempt. They had quotas. Tokyo demanded progress. The Burma front needed supplies. Lives were expendable. Time was not. Then came the Speedo periods. When deadlines loomed, when Tokyo's pressure mounted, the engineers responded with one solution: work faster. Quotas doubled. Rest periods vanished. The sick were dragged from their huts and forced onto the line. No work, no food. It didn't matter if you were dying. It didn't matter if you could barely stand. You worked, or you starved. The guards enforced it with fists and boots and bamboo clubs. Many of them were Korean conscripts, caught in their own nightmare of imperial service, venting rage on men even more powerless than themselves. Beatings became routine. A man too slow laying rail. A man who stumbled. A man who looked the wrong way. Blood in the mud was as common as rain. In those first weeks, the prisoners tried to hold on to who they were. Dark humor became armor. British soldiers joked about the menu at Changi compared to this jungle cafe. Australians sang filthy songs while hauling timber. Some prayed. Others went silent, retreating into themselves, conserving what little energy remained. But the jungle had its own agenda. Disease arrived like an occupying army. Malaria spiked fevers to delirium. Dysentery turned men into skeletons in days. Cholera swept through work camps in waves, killing dozens overnight. And then came the ulcers, tropical sores that started as scratches and spread into open wounds, eating through muscle, exposing bone. Men watched their own legs rot while still being forced to stand. There were no hospitals, only makeshift medical huts with no medicine, no bandages, no hope. Doctors operated with pocket knives. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Screams echoed through the jungle canopy. The Japanese policy was clear. The railway mattered more than lives. Men collapsed on the embankments and were left where they fell. Bodies were dragged into shallow graves dug by their own comrades. Wooden crosses, when there was time, marked the dead. Most got nothing, just jungle soil and the sound of hammers driving the next spike. Within 3 months, the first graves outnumbered the miles of completed track. They were not supposed to speak. Not supposed to remember. Not supposed to write. The Japanese forbade diaries, confiscated pencils, punished anyone caught recording what they saw, but the prisoners wrote anyway, on scraps of paper, on the backs of medical forms, in margins of salvaged books. They carved words into bamboo. They memorized names and dates like prayers. Because if they didn't record it, if they didn't say it out loud, it might disappear. And so might they. In those first weeks, the words were raw, unfiltered shock. One British sergeant scribbled in a hidden journal, "This is madness, pure madness. They expect us to build a railway through the country that would kill a man just walking through it." An Australian private recorded his first thought at seeing the jungle: "We'll never survive this." A Dutch officer wrote simply, "They're going to work us to death, and they don't care." But shock hardened into something sharper, something defiant. The British, as they always did, turned to humor, dark, bitter, necessary. They nicknamed the worst sections of the line Hellfire Pass, where men blasted through solid rock with hammers and chisels; Cholera Gulch, where the disease claimed dozens in a single night. One work camp was called the Pack of Cards because men collapsed like a deck being shuffled. An officer joked in his diary, "Extended holiday in tropical paradise. Accommodations, 4 stars, service, brutal. I would not recommend it." It wasn't funny, but it kept them sane. Others fought back in silence. Small acts of sabotage became quiet rebellion. Rail spikes loosened just enough to fail under weight. The bridge supports left fractionally weaker than required. Calculations deliberately miscalculated. One engineer later admitted, "We built it to fall apart, not immediately, but eventually." They stole when they could, an extra handful of rice, a forgotten tool, a guard's cigarette, not for comfort, for survival, for control, for the tiny, desperate thrill of taking something back. Some men turned inward, spiritual searching. A chaplain recorded prayers spoken over mass graves. "We ask not why this happens, but for strength to endure it." Men wrote letters they knew would never be sent, to wives, to mothers, to children who might never know their father's fates. One letter found decades later in a survivor's kit read, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Tell them I tried. Tell them I thought of them every day." But the most powerful act was not rebellion. It was a remembrance. Men from different countries, Britain, Australia, the Netherlands, America, formed networks that defied language and rank. They shared rations when there was nothing to share. They carried the sick when they could barely walk themselves. They buried the dead with whatever dignity the jungle allowed, a cross, a name, a moment of silence. In camps where death was routine, they made it sacred. One survivor later testified, "We didn't know each other before. We were strangers thrown together by surrender, but we became brothers, not because we wanted to, because we had to." They learned each other's names, not ranks, not numbers, names. They repeated them like incantations, at roll call, at burials, in the dark before sleep. Because in a place designed to erase their identity, they spoke each other's names and refused to be forgotten. Kanyu cutting, 75 meters deep, solid rock. The Japanese engineers looked at the mountain and decided it had to go. No detour, no alternative route, straight through, and they had no machinery to do it. Only men, and time they didn't have. So they gave the prisoners hammers, chisels, explosives with fuses that burned too fast or not at all, and they demanded the impossible. The work never stopped. Day bled into night, night into day. When darkness fell, they lit torches, bamboo poles wrapped in rags soaked in diesel. Flames flickered against rock walls, casting shadows that danced like demons. The prisoners swung hammers by firelight, sparks flying with every strike, the sound echoing through the cutting like thunder trapped in stone. That's why they called it Hellfire Pass. It looked like the mouth of hell, and it swallowed men whole. May 1943. The Speedo period reached its peak. Tokyo wanted the railway finished by autumn. The engineers responded with quotas that defied biology. Work shifts stretched to 20 hours, then 22. Some men worked around the clock, no sleep, no rest, just the endless rhythm of steel on stone. They hallucinated. Exhaustion twisted reality. Men saw rivers where there was only dust. They spoke to brothers who died weeks before. They swung hammers at phantoms, and still they worked. Because stopping meant death. Some dropped mid-swing, hearts gave out, bodies collapsed like marionettes with cut strings. Their comrades dragged them aside and kept hammering. There was no time to mourn, no time to think, just the next strike, the next breath, the next second. The toll was staggering. In a single month at Hellfire Pass, over 700 men died. Disease, exhaustion, accidents, beatings. The guards showed no mercy. A man who slowed was beaten. A man who fell was kicked until he stood or stopped moving permanently. And through it all, the doctors fought. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Edward Weary Dunlop, an Australian surgeon who became a legend on the railway. He operated without anesthesia, amputated limbs with saws meant for cutting wood, sterilized instruments in boiling water when he had water at all. He argued with Japanese officers, risking execution to save his men. He stood between guards and patients, absorbing blows meant for the dying. One survivor later said, "Weary saved my life 3 times, once on the operating table, twice by talking the guards out of killing me." But even Dunlop couldn't save them all. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Some men broke completely. They stopped speaking, stopped eating, stared into nothing until nothing stared back. Others found something deeper, a reserve of will they didn't know existed. They became automatons of survival, no thought, no emotion, just motion. Hammer, chisel, breathe, repeat. One British officer wrote in his hidden journal, "We are no longer men. We are machines made of meat, and we will keep running until we don't." The cutting inched forward, meter by meter, paid for in blood and bone. Every night, torches burned. Every morning, bodies were carried out. The dead outnumbered the living in the memories of those who survived. They said if they made it through hellfire, nothing else in life could ever break them. Most didn't make it through. October 17, 1943, the final rail spike was driven. 258 miles of track, cut through mountains, laid across rivers, carved from a jungle that had resisted every attempt at civilization for centuries. The Thai-Burma Railway was complete, 2 months ahead of schedule. The Japanese called it a triumph of will and engineering. The prisoners called it a graveyard. The numbers were staggering. Over 12,000 Allied prisoners of war died. British, Australian, Dutch, American. More than 90,000 Asian laborers, Burmese, Malay, Tamil workers forced into the same hell perished alongside them. For every mile of track laid, over 400 men died. The railway wasn't built with steel and timber. It was built with corpses. The Japanese organized a ceremony. Officers arrived in pressed uniforms. Photographers documented the moment for propaganda back in Tokyo. Prisoners of war were assembled to witness the occasion, skeletal figures in rags, barely able to stand, forced to bow as dignitaries praised their achievement. One Australian survivor later wrote, "They wanted us to clap, to celebrate. I looked at the men around me, hollow eyes, skin stretched over bone. Half of us couldn't stand without leaning on each other. They wanted us to celebrate the thing that killed our friends." Some prisoners felt nothing, just numbness, exhaustion too deep for emotion. Others felt disbelief, not pride, but shock that they were still breathing, that they'd survived when so many hadn't. But survival was relative. The railway opened. Trains began running supplies north to the Burma front, but the strategic value Tokyo had promised never materialized. Within months, Allied bombers from the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces targeted the line relentlessly. Bridges were destroyed, tracks twisted into useless metal. The bridge on the River Kwai, immortalized later in film, was bombed repeatedly. Sections of the railway became impassable. The blood and death had bought Japan almost nothing. And for the prisoners, completion changed nothing. They remained in camps, still starving, still dying. Disease didn't stop because the rails were laid. Men who'd survived 18 months of labor collapsed in the weeks after, their bodies finally surrendering to accumulated trauma, malaria, dysentery. Infections that had been ignored for months now claimed lives in quiet, anticlimactic deaths. But even in the dying, they documented. Secret diaries continued. Names were recorded, dates, crimes. The prisoners of war knew what had been done to them. They knew the world would need proof. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toucey, who commanded British prisoners at the Tamarkan camp, kept detailed records despite the risk of execution. Doctors preserved medical logs showing deliberate neglect and brutality. Survivors memorized the names of guards who had been beaten, tortured, and murdered. These records would become evidence. At the Tokyo War Crimes trials after 1945, testimonies from the railway would help convict Japanese officers and guards of crimes against humanity. Some would hang. Others would spend decades in prison. But justice came too late for the dead. The railway was complete. Trains rattled through the jungle, carrying ammunition and rice to a front that was already collapsing. The prisoners remained, skeletal, traumatized, counting days until a liberation they weren't sure would ever come. The railway was complete, but for the men who built it, the war inside never ended. August 1945, the war ended. News reached the camp slowly, first rumors, then whispers, then confirmation. Japan had surrendered. The guards vanished overnight. Some fled into the jungle. Others simply stopped showing up. The gates remained open. No one locked them anymore. The prisoners didn't celebrate, not immediately. They were too weak, too cautious, too scarred by years of false hope. When Allied forces arrived, British, American, Australian troops parachuting into remote camps or arriving by convoy, they found living ghosts. Men weighing 70 pounds, skeletons with eyes, survivors who could barely walk, couldn't speak without coughing blood, couldn't comprehend that they were finally free. One medic wrote in his report, "I've seen battlefields, I've seen bombed cities, but nothing prepared me for this. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were the aftermath of something worse than war." Repatriation took months. Planes and ships carried them home, to Britain, to Australia, to the Netherlands, to America. Families waited at docks and airfields, scanning faces they didn't recognize. Fathers returned as strangers. Sons came home changed beyond recognition. The nightmares followed them. For decades, survivors woke screaming. They heard hammers in the silence, smelled jungle rot in clean air. Some couldn't work, couldn't adapt, couldn't explain what they'd seen to people who hadn't been there. Post-traumatic stress wasn't diagnosed then. It was just called being broken. But they demanded justice. The Tokyo war crimes trials began in 1946. Evidence poured in from survivors, secret diaries, medical logs, testimonies detailing beatings, starvation, murder. Japanese officers and guards were prosecuted. Some were executed. Lieutenant General Shinpei Fukui, who oversaw railway construction, was sentenced to death and hanged in 1947. Others received prison terms. But many escaped. Lower-ranking guards disappeared into post-war chaos. Korean conscripts, themselves victims of imperial conscription, were never prosecuted. The full accounting never came. The railway remained. Portions of the track are still in use today. Trains carry tourists through the jungle. The bridge on the River Kwai stands rebuilt, a destination for travelers seeking history they don't fully understand. Memorials line the route. Cemeteries hold thousands of white crosses. Kanchanaburi War Cemetery in Thailand. Thambusayet War Cemetery in Myanmar. Names carved in stone. Dates. Ages. Boys who never came home. Survivors returned. Not all of them, but some. Reunions were held. Oral history projects recorded their voices before time silenced them. Books emerged. Eric Lomax wrote The Railway Man, confronting the trauma and eventually meeting one of his torturers in an act of painful reconciliation. Memoirs, documentaries, testimonies preserved for generations who would never meet these men. Hollywood told the story too. The Bridge on the River Kwai won Oscars in 1957, but it sanitized the horror, turned brutality into drama, made the railway seem like a test of British resolve rather than a genocidal labor project. Survivors hated it. They knew the truth, and they spent the rest of their lives correcting the record. The railway became a symbol of atrocity, of endurance, of what human beings can survive and what they should never have to. Today, the jungle reclaims sections of track. Vines strangle rusted rails. Wooden sleepers rot into soil. Nature erases what men built with blood. But the names remain, carved in stone, spoken at ceremonies, remembered.